In the heart of Canaan, Jacob lived with his 12 sons, but among them Joseph, born to his beloved wife Rachel, held a special place in his heart. This fondness was evident in the richly ornamented coat Jacob gifted Joseph, a gesture that stirred deep resentment among his brothers. Joseph was not just his father's favorite. He was also a dreamer of profound dreams. One night, he dreamt of sheaves in the field. His sheaf stood upright while those of his brothers gathered around and bowed to it. When he shared this dream, his brothers bristled with envy and scorn. "Will you indeed reign over us?" they asked disdainfully. Another dream followed, in which the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed to Joseph. Even Jacob rebuked him for this, questioning what such a dream could mean. Yet, deep inside, Jacob pondered the possibility of something divine at play. The brothers' envy turned to malice. When Joseph was sent by Jacob to check on them in the fields, they seized the opportunity to rid themselves of the dreamer. They conspired to kill him, but settled on a less bloody scheme at the behest of Reuben, the eldest, who secretly intended to rescue Joseph later. They stripped Joseph of his colorful robe and threw him into a pit. As fate would have it, a caravan of Ishmaelites was passing by. Judah, another brother, suggested they sell Joseph to these traders. So for 20 pieces of silver, they rid themselves of their brother, deceiving Jacob into believing that Joseph had been devoured by a wild animal. Joseph, now a slave, was taken to Egypt and sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. In this foreign land, away from everything he knew, Joseph's character and faith were tested. Yet, the Lord was with him, and he prospered in Potiphar's house. Recognizing Joseph's abilities and God's presence in his life, Potiphar made him overseer of his house. However, Joseph's trials were far from over. Falsely accused of misconduct by Potiphar's wife, and unable to defend his integrity, he was thrown into prison. But even there, God's favor followed him. Joseph earned the trust of the prison warden and was put in charge of all the inmates. It was in this dark place that Joseph's gift of interpreting dreams came to light again. He accurately interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, who were also in prison. The cupbearer, upon his release and reinstatement, forgot about Joseph until 2 years later, when Pharaoh had 2 disturbing dreams that none could interpret. Remembering Joseph, the cupbearer mentioned him to Pharaoh. Joseph was hastily brought from the dungeon to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. God gave Joseph the insight that Egypt would experience 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh appointed him as governor over all Egypt, second only to the throne. During the 7 plentiful years, Joseph gathered and stored immense quantities of grain. When famine struck, not only Egypt, but also surrounding lands felt its grip. Back in Canaan, Jacob and his family faced starvation. Hearing of the grain stores in Egypt, Jacob sent his sons, except for Benjamin, to buy food. In Egypt, Joseph's brothers came before him, but they did not recognize him. Recalling his dreams, Joseph saw their fulfillment. He spoke harshly to them, accusing them of being spies. After imprisoning them for 3 days, he released all but Simon, demanding that they bring their youngest brother as proof of their honesty. Tormented by guilt over what they had done to Joseph, they returned to Jacob, who reluctantly allowed Benjamin to go with them on their second journey to Egypt, fearing for his safety. When they returned with Benjamin, Joseph's emotions were stirred. He invited them to dine at his house, treating Benjamin with special favor. Still, he did not reveal his identity. To test his brothers further, he had his silver cup secretly placed in Benjamin's sack. When the cup was discovered, Joseph demanded that Benjamin become his slave. At this, Judah stepped forward, offering himself as a substitute for Benjamin, recounting their father's grief over the loss of Joseph and his love for Benjamin. It was then that Joseph could no longer contain himself. He revealed his identity to his astonished brothers, weeping loudly. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Joseph's revelation was a profound moment of reconciliation and forgiveness. He comforted his brothers, assuring them of his forgiveness and God's providence in his journey. He urged them to bring their father and their families to Egypt, where he would provide for them. When Jacob heard that Joseph was alive, his spirit revived. Overwhelmed with joy and disbelief, he journeyed to Egypt, where he was reunited with his son after many years of mourning. Seeing Joseph alive was enough for Jacob. He could now die in peace. In Egypt, the family of Jacob, now called Israel, settled in the land of Goshen, where they grew and prospered. Joseph continued to administer Egypt during the famine, earning respect and gratitude from the Egyptians and Pharaoh. Joseph's story is a remarkable tale of faith, perseverance, and divine providence. From the favored son to a slave, from a prisoner to the governor of Egypt, his life exemplifies how faith in God can guide one through the darkest of times. His ability to forgive his brothers and see God's hand in his life's events teaches us about the power of forgiveness and God's unerring plan. As an elderly man, Joseph spoke to his brothers, reassuring them of his continued forgiveness and God's plan. He prophesied that God would lead their descendants out of Egypt and back to the promised land. Joseph's faith in God's promises remained unshaken till the end. Joseph died in Egypt at the age of 110. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin, but not before he made the children of Israel promise to carry his bones back to the promised land when God led them out of Egypt. This promise was fulfilled many years later during the Exodus. The story of Joseph remains a powerful testimony to the human spirit's resilience and the unfathomable ways of God. It is a story that resonates across generations, teaching us about the importance of trust in God, the power of forgiveness, and the mysterious workings of divine providence in our lives.